All right, so for this next lecture, we're going to talk more about performance. So we have three terms up here. Performance, which we already started to define as embodied cultural action bounded by specific places and times. Next, we have performative. So when we're talking about performatives, it comes out of speech act theory. Performative speech is speech that does something when it's spoken. So the canonical example is, for example, the wedding vow. You're at the church, and to each other you say, I do, and in the speaking of I do, it is done. The marriage bond is created. So performative as speaking of these symbolic speech acts, or in a larger sense, these very symbolic things filled with meaning. So performatives are not the same as performance, though they share related meanings. And finally down here we have performativity, which is a really key term for thinking about performance studies. If we're thinking about identities in terms of performativity, we're thinking about how the cultural scripts of identity itself exist beyond us, or if we're talking about cultures, really nothing in a culture is ever written down. It's all information that becomes transmitted through bodies and through actions and through performances, not so much through text. So if we're thinking about the meanings as existing in the cultural sphere, performativity talks about our individual performances that always try to approximate that knowledge. So for example, if you yourself do something that you would call traditional, you can say what this tradition may be, but we could question that all the way down the line to find out whether or not it's true. But what matters is the ways in which it's performed and the ways in which, through performance, you try to approximate this ideal notion of tradition, right? So performativity emphasizes sequences and multiple performances and imperfection and the ways in which it can never fully be perfected. So if we're talking about performing identity, we also get these terms from several of the readings. For example, in the article on selling Chineseness, this is where we most strongly get public identity versus private identity. So we see in the transformation of private identity into public identity, we begin to rely on the codes of Orientalism. There's the freezing of time, there's the conflation of identities and differences, and just the sheer exoticism that comes to characterize the public identity. So one way we can think about this transition from the private to the public is thinking about the multiple demands put on identity and difference in the public sphere. So if we're thinking about the multiple demands put on identity in the public sphere, we're thinking about, for example, the different modes of cultural regulation. If we're talking about Asian Pacific Americans, we're thinking about how so much of our recognition is based around Orientalism. Or if we're talking about US Latinas and Latinos, we're then thinking about the ways in which public recognition so much takes place around tropicalization or criminality. So, on the one hand, we could always use public identity to be something political and contestatory, to create new meanings. But on the other hand, if we're going to live in the reality of the line between politics and capital, we then think about our own complicity as well as what the larger audience demands of us. We don't go to Chinatown because it's authentically Chinese, we go there because it sells us a particular version of Chineseness. So, on page 160, as we head towards the end of the article on the Chinatown parade, the author argues that the parade became more about, quote, patronizing the notion of liberal individualism rather than challenging structural racism. And that takes us to the key question of public and private, and also one of the key themes of the course. What does diversity mean? So in several of these readings, the authors become very critical about this term multiculturalism, which, based on our discussions, we recognized as being a good thing. Like multiple cultures, every culture has a place within the melting pot, the salad bowl, whatever metaphor you want to use. But what the authors want us to think about are these larger structures of regulation and these larger sedimented differences that come to characterize American society. So if we're talking about structural racism, we're no longer talking just about stereotypes, we're talking about the ways in which race comes to matter materially. So what multiculturalism can do is take us to this level of challenging institutionalized and structural racism, but we have to move past the level of just images, which in some of the popular culture texts, I've tried to suggest they start to take us there. So this is also an issue that happens in Evan Cooper's article on John Leguizamo, except the words it takes on this time is on page 439, public embarrassment versus private enjoyment. And as we get to the very end, Cooper suggests some of the ways in which culturally intimate humor can do something really important for the in community. One of the things he says is it can give a special kind of aesthetic gratification. So if we're talking about popular culture, again, keep in mind the line between affect and the aesthetic. Think about on this line that pleasure is something really important when we're thinking about the consumption of these particular texts. And I want to point us to this. Affect is not the same as effect. Even though effect becomes a verb by substituting the E for an A, affect talks about feelings and sensations, whereas effect is in terms of cause and effect. So don't muddy up the terms and don't just toss out affect, just use other words like feelings or pleasure. Cooper's article draws us to this distinction that John Leguizamo himself makes between prototypes and stereotypes. And this takes us to this really ethically sticky issue about representing one's own community and one's own experiences as we go from these private realms of representation to the public. And finally, third way we can talk about performing identity is in Deborah Wong's book chapter. On page 131, she talks about the New York Asian Pacific American Festival in terms of real communities versus imagined communities, and how community becomes constructed through performance. As she says, there are very real Chinatowns and little Manilas and little Tokyos, real parts of the city that have become marked as Asian American. But if we're talking about the building of community, this is something that happens only momentarily and through the types of musical performances that she talks about in her article. And finally, on page 133, she talks about wanting a critical multiculturalism. As we said before, part of the reason why we take this dive into Asian Pacific American and US Latino popular cultures is to think about critical multiculturalism, not just representing identity, but challenging difference, challenging the way identity is created, challenging the norms of the public sphere, challenging racism, and challenging the sediments of history that come to all affect dimensions of structural racism. All right? So that's it for this lecture.